Hello, everyone. I'm Sukeert Shanker. I'm the founder and CEO of Aeldra, and I'm delighted to have Greg Kidd with us. Greg is a legendary investor in Silicon Valley and an early investor in a lot of companies that are now global names, including Twitter, Square, Ripple, Coinbase, Robinhood, and many others. And Greg, thank you so much for joining. It's tremendously exciting to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, and excited about your future there too.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So why don't I start with a quick introduction, Greg, that of you, and I'll try to do it justice. He founded Dispatch Management, a company with a messaging platform for couriers, and this is where he met and hired Jack Dorsey, the founder and CEO of Twitter. Greg was then at the Federal Reserve and then Promontory, a regulatory and compliance consulting firm. And he was also an angel investor. And as I mentioned, he's an early investor in Twitter, Square, Coinbase, Ripple, Robinhood. So that's quite a track record over many, many years. And he was also an early investor in Aeldra. And I'm hoping that over time, Aeldra gets spoken about first when they talk about Greg's portfolio. Why don't we start with the big question, right? People would be excited to learn a little bit about your investment philosophy and approach, and what has made you so consistently successful in identifying at a fairly early age companies that have really gone on to sort of reinvent social media, how people communicate, technology, and financial services.
I think the big difference is there's lots of ideas out there, there's lots of technology, but if you look in history, the really, really big investments have been things that are based on what I'd call an insight rather than an idea. Ideas are things that are like from your head. Insight is sort of something more from the gut or the heart. And so an example of an insight would be, hey, like computers can be for people rather than businesses. That's the insight that Steve Jobs had, or Bill Gates was like, hey, there could be an operating system that works on all hardware platforms rather than one for each. And Mark Zuckerberg was like, hey, people like to share. And Jack Dorsey was really that, hey, freedom of speech is really the right to choose who you listen to rather than who you speak to. And so each of those, that's well beyond an idea. And so when you have an insight, you really can move mountains. And so for your company, for instance, there's an insight that, hey, you don't just have to be an American to want to have an account in a sort of a safe havens place like the US, that access to that is something that globally is wanted. And in addition to that being an insight, there's a democratization element there, that it's really access to something. And so when you're dealing with something as earth and groundbreaking as saying democratization of who can send out and publish a message, well, that's Twitter. Who can take a payment? Well, that's Square. And so yes, there's some technology, but the real insight is there's a democratization movement. And with your company, and the reason that I'm invested and I want to be involved is it is a democratization insight. And so those investments tend to have the ability to not be like 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. Those are the things that can be 1,000 to 1 because they transform our entire society. Even if they start with a fairly narrow use case, the insight is there that is fungible and extensible, and can result in these 1,000 to 1 returns as opposed to the much smaller returns that venture capitalists typically are willing to settle for. And so, the other thing is just that some of the people that I've learned a lot from were folks that they might not have been considered like mainstream people. Like when I met Jack, he was shy. He actually stuttered a bit, but he's the one who taught me about like Java. And so like I learned things from people, and sometimes those socially awkward people, they don't say a lot, but when they do say something, there's a message to be gleaned.
On the consumer side, quite often it's about timing, right?
Yes.
Which is the market ready? Is the technology ready? Are the regulators ready? So it's all about the confluence of things coming at any single point in time. Because, for instance, people throw, globalization. They've been talking about it for 40 years, right? The rise of India and China, they've been talking about it for 20 years. And so on the consumer side, it's about the consumers being ready and also the enablers, the infrastructure being ready, even like tech stacks and identity systems in India and China, for example, right? So, how much do you think, the time is now for truly seamless global banking, finally, on the consumer side?
Well, it's like you get tailwinds, like for Zoom. I mean, Zoom was bumping along. I think they had like 10 million users. The pandemic came along, and they were the easiest to set up appointments. They didn't have great security, but they were just there. And so this concept of like, when is the world ready for a global wallet? Like the concept that everybody in the world has a right to an identity, but like an identity itself, if you don't have like the ability to message people or have money, you're kind of still like living in a silo. And so identity, we say, is the permission to act. And in our world, acting means talking and buying and selling or doing things in the exchange economy, communist, capitalist, et cetera. The question is the world ready? It's still not quite yet ready yet for a global wallet. Why do I say that? WeChat is there. They've done a great wallet that goes with a messaging system, but the rest of the world isn't willing to tolerate the kind of privacy invasion that goes along with the WeChat Chinese approach. So they clearly have a superior product, but it's tough getting it going outside of China. The alternative, Telegram, they have a very good product. They were going to do Gram, have a wallet that would be added to the messaging platform. They weren't particularly regulator friendly, and so they got in a quarrel with the SEC, and they basically got it handed to them, and so now they've had to like scale back. Same thing with Facebook. They had Libra. They kind of, people weren't afraid about it because it wasn't going to work. They were afraid it was going to work. And so in each of those areas, what we're told is that technologically, the world might be ready for a global wallet, but right now still regulators and other powerful market forces are pretty active in thwarting that. But that doesn't mean that the planets won't align and something won't break through. I clearly think that the world is ready to have a wallet that's interoperable and works everywhere, that is truly portable, that the wallet is above the companies and the countries. It really is a wallet that belongs to the person, can hold any form of value. I want to be part of that. I think you're part of that because you're figuring out how to make access to a particular kind of form of value, which is not just US dollars, but US dollars in an FDIC insured institution, accessible by everyone. That's part of the big vision. But the hurdles that you have is the hurdles that we have as a society from getting into the world we live in today to a world that looks more like Star Trek. So the planets aren't perfectly aligned for that yet. But man, the pandemic was a kick in the pants. The fact that WeChat, Telegram, and Facebook are all knocking at the door, they're all indicators that were around that period of time when things could align and crystallize, and the future could become our present. So I'm excited to be around at this time, and I'm excited to place bets on companies like yours.
Oh, that's terrific. And when I spoke to you about global ID back in October, I felt that was a big idea, right? All caps. Since then, what have you seen it developing into, and what do you see it developing into over the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, like again, the pandemic was a big wake-up call, and you're beginning to see the signs that people want to travel again. And so the question is, how are you going to enter countries, get on airplanes, go to restaurants without a credential that says you're safe, either because you have a negative test, you've already had COVID and you have antibodies, or you have the vaccine. And if we all try to solve that problem in little silos, then it's like we're going backwards in time. We're going back to a world when everything was separated. And while we still like localization, you want to be able to move around the world, and you want people to be able to trust you. We have another problem. We have people that don't trust votes. They don't trust elections. And so we have a couple of things that happened this year where there's like a huge pandemic, a lack of confidence in basic things like voting. And so the question becomes, how can you have a voting system where you can make sure that everybody who legally can vote, and that all votes are just counted once? And so I don't know how you're going to do that without a system that starts with identity. How are you going to do a voter roll How are you going to keep track of whether people voted once or multiple times without identity? And so all of those things are tailwinds for an operation like Global ID. And the reason we picked the name Global ID, it's not some sort of catchy name. It sounds more like a protocol because that's what it's meant to be. It means that we'll work with anybody that's looking to come up with a standard, a protocol approach to identity, just like we have a World Wide Web protocol approach. So we don't end up with a Chinese internet and a Brazilian internet, we end up with a World Wide Web. We need the same thing with identity so we can tackle problems like health credentials worldwide and voting, to make sure that voting is, whether it's very local, regional, national, or even if we're voting on things, God forbid, in a somewhat globalized voting type world, like that we can have confidence in those systems. And so the problems are big enough to be a forcing function for solutions that are bolder than what we had before. And so once again, I'm excited to be around, never let a good crisis go to waste.